feel a bit of a fraud because you probably all know 100 times more about the subject than I do, but it is a subject that is very, very close to my heart. I've been finding out an awful lot more about it in recent months and years, and really am committed to trying to do what I can in Parliament and maybe also in Brighton and Hove to push this agenda further and to see if we can get to a position where drugs are causing an awful lot less harm in society than they are today. And of course you'll know that Brighton and Hove, where my constituency of Brighton Pavilion sits, has the very unwanted title of the drugs death capital of the UK. And so my concern around this issue is very much driven as well by the fact that it's very much at the top of the agenda in the city that I represent. But of course, drugs policy remains one of the most controversial issues facing politicians. There's widespread acceptance, I think, that current policy simply isn't working. And sometimes that acceptance can even come from quite important people. At least it comes from them until they become important. So you've got even David Cameron, when he was a member of the Home Affairs Select Committee, saying, you know, this whole system's not working. And then as soon as he becomes in a position to actually do something about it as Prime Minister, he suffers a sort of unaccountable phase of amnesia and just cannot be, you know, shaken into doing something about this. And that's a real problem. And of course, a lot of it's about fear, and presumably fear of public opinion. And yet opinion polls indicate that the vast majority of people think, for example, that it shouldn't be a criminal offence to use cannabis. So fear, this fear that so many politicians feel, is often less about the facts and more about how they're presented by a small minority of very vocal media. And I'm sure we can all think of those people, who in turn help to determine the opinions of their readership. Now, earlier this year, I made clear my intention to try to promote drug policy reform, starting with a call for personal drug use to be decriminalised. Brighton and Hove's Chief Superintendent lent his support to that, and together we secured front-page coverage in the local paper, the Argus. Coverage that, while it did fall into the common trap of conflating legislation and legalisation and decriminalisation, nonetheless, the coverage was relatively benign, and I'm sure that was, you know, in part because we had the cover, if you like, of the approval of the local constabulary, and particularly of this particular Chief Superintendent. But in fact, really, the city's approach to the whole issue, I think, has been hugely encouraging, and it's given me hope that a reasonable, mature and informed debate, where those of us questioning current policy are not subject to accusations of irresponsibility and worse, is actually genuinely possible, that we could really have that debate. That one of the city's Conservative MPs is also open to rethinking drugs policy, I think should help enormously too. So my starting point is basically that reducing the harms associated with drug addiction is crucial. And you will know the agreement across the scientific community, as well as amongst the police and legal profession, that harm reduction means moving away from prohibition. And of course, we've got some very important people that are reiterating this. Chairman of the UK Bar Council, Nicholas Green QC, has said, and I quote, "A growing body of comparative evidence suggests that decriminalising personal use can have positive consequences. It can free up huge amounts of police resources, reduce crime and recidivism, and improve public health. All of this can be achieved without any overall increase in drug usage." The personal view of Brighton and Hove's Chief Superintendent Bartlett, the Chief Superintendent I mentioned a moment ago, is, and I quote, "Whilst production, supply and trafficking are and should remain crimes, the use of drugs is not well addressed through punitive measures. Providing people with treatment not only resolves their addiction, thereby minimising risk of overdose, drug-related death issues, antisocial behaviour and dependence on the state, for example, but it also cuts the cost to the community by reducing offending." And so since becoming an MP, I've spent a lot of time with a range of people in Brighton and Hove who have an interest in drugs policy, and they include GPs, drug users, providers of drug education, the police, families of addicts, those who treat and support drug users. And maybe unsurprisingly, I found the vast majority of them are committed to doing much more to reduce drug deaths in the city. And what surprised me really, and given me real grounds of optimism, is that there is a real appetite for using our experiences to try and shape a more evidence-based national drug strategy than the one that is pursued by successive governments to date. Just to provide a little bit of context, let me just say a few words about the coalition government's current strategy. You'll know that a new strategy was brought out a few months back. We were told it was supposed to be, and I quote, "a fundamentally different approach to tackling drugs, an entirely new ambition to reduce drug use and dependence." And yet there's a lot of concern about it. There's nothing new really about continuing with the so-called war on drugs, and that is what this strategy does. And while that continues, I think the Home Secretary's ambition is sadly unlikely to be realised. Indeed, all of the evidence suggests that underneath all of the rebranding, this is the same tired old strategy that we've seen before, and therefore won't facilitate a much-needed reduction in drug-related death and drug-related harms. One of my particular concerns is the introduction of so-called payment by results, starting with the fact that there's little clarity about what the said results are actually expected to be. Suggestions include meeting targets for moving people from treatment into recovery, with payment dependent on individuals not representing within 12 months of discharge. Well, first of all, 12 months isn't very long, and secondly, I think that could lead to attention being focused on treating those who have, what people perceive to be the best prospects of a favourable outcome, to the detriment of more difficult cases, if you like. I think there are fears too that access to prescribed methadone might be time limited, or that there might be benefit sanctions for those deemed not to be sufficiently addressing their drug dependence. I think allowing time and space for people to relapse is critical. For those who want to end a drug dependence, relapse along the way is often part of the journey to eventual recovery, and denying that, I think, is likely to be counterproductive, especially if it is treated as a failure that then triggers sanctions. Moreover, if providers need to predict a 100% success rate in tenders and they face penalties if they fail to meet that, probably an impossible target, I think there's a danger that small voluntary sector providers with extensive expertise will actually lose out to larger private outsourcing contractors who can front-end the financial risks involved in that kind of model. Well, earlier this month, I hosted a drugs roundtable in Brighton and Hove, attended by around 35 people, actually including Neve, who was fantastic, representing the NHS, the City Council, the police, drug users and practitioners. And one of the areas we discussed is the role played by abstinence programmes, which are favoured by the government and which are likely to be subject to these payment by results. And in particular, we examined whether the national emphasis on drug-free recovery alone runs the risks that individuals with a drug dependency will disengage from the treatment system, in turn resulting in an increase in illicit use. Brighton and Hove's council have what they call an intelligent commissioning programme, and it's done some research around drugs, and I think it does flag that this might have implications for the drug-related death rate, given the likelihood of reduced tolerance to opiates whilst participating in abstinence-focused treatment pathways. Our roundtable acknowledged there's a risk and underlined the importance of offering choice and flexibility, while at the same time absolutely paying tribute to the effectiveness of the city's only abstinence-based residential programme, which is run by the Brighton Housing Trust. So in a sense, we were saying that we have some concerns by the government, the way in which it is pushing an abstinence-based approach because of the risks that it's then linked to things like the payment by results. But that's not to say that there should not be abstinence-based programmes on offer, and I think what we want to see in the city is a real range of different programmes. So it was clear that while there's a strong commitment to increasing the opportunities for drug users to be completely free from drugs, much more can and should be done. And in particular, the roundtable expressed a wish to be much more ambitious on behalf of the city's drug users. There was a big debate actually between the Brighton Housing Trust, which obviously comes from an abstinence-based focus, and some of the organisations that were providing the methadone scripts and so forth. But I think everybody agreed that whichever path people are taking, there needs to be much more stress on asking what next. If you're on a methadone script, how do we make sure that people aren't just kind of parked there and sort of, that they become less of a problem, if you like, as far as society is concerned. But then what do we do? Are they there 10 years later? Are they there 20 years later? Are we still pushing as far as we can to see if they can move to the next step if they want to and can? I think crucially, Brighton and Hove wants service users, wants the service users themselves to be defining what success and recovery is, not politicians, not the PCT, or indeed anyone else. We talked a lot as well about the combination of people taking heroin, let's say, but also linking that with more and more prescribing of benzodiazepines and the way in which we need to be far more rigorous, really, about the prescription of benzos. And there were some concrete examples around looking at prescription advice, such as taking dosages down to lower mgs, so that people weren't being able to stack up quite so many of those. I think innovation like that risks being sidelined if national strategy fixates on one approach alone, but I think in the city we seem determined to try to resist that happening and to build on what we know about the city's drug use and to do things better. Now, in her introduction to last year's new drug strategy document, the Home Secretary asserts that drug use in the UK remains too high, which is kind of an interesting way of putting it, because it kind of then begs the question, well, what is an acceptable level of drug use? The government's answer is simple, none at all. And as I say, their focus then falls purely on full abstinence, eradication, and a narrative which measures success only in those terms. Now, we all know that drug misuse destroys individuals, it destroys families, and it destroys communities. And I believe that all of these harms could be significantly reduced if the government acknowledged the fact that a repressive prohibition-based approach simply isn't working. In fact, I'd go further and say that prioritising punishment above treatment, those strategies actually keep drug use high, whilst at the same time damaging efforts to reduce drug-related harm and facilitate recovery. And successive British governments, I think, have put their faith rather blindly in the idea that the illegality of drugs is in itself a deterrent. Nothing, it seems, could actually be further from the truth. And that's why I think we do need to be considering the decriminalisation of drug use, treatment and support for addicts and users, not punishment, perhaps even regulation of drug markets rather than the current free-for-all. And any debate on drug policy needs to reflect the facts, not only what's happening here in Britain, but also learning from what's happening in countries like Portugal, where you'll know that the number of people taking heroin has halved since its use was decriminalised. In Switzerland, a series of new policies based on public health rather than legality led to a sharp decline in heroin demand and crime. And a comparison between Norway, which has a very liberal regime, yet similar levels of drug use to Sweden, where very strict controls are in place, suggests that there is actually very little correlation between levels of punishment and levels of drug taking. And in Brighton and Hove, just from the economic point of view, for every £1 spent on Operation Reduction, which is a police approach to drugs and drug-related crime that gives people the choice to engage with treatment pathways, then £3 has been saved for every £1 spent on that programme, with drug-related offending cut by around 60%. One consequence of Britain's emphasis on criminalising and punishing drug use is that success is measured in terms of the number and size of drug seizures, how many people are arrested, the severity of prison sentences, not in terms of reduced harm to individuals or society or levels of organised crime. And it's quite fascinating, I think, really, that there's been no cost-benefit assessment of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act here in Britain, or any attempt to compare its effectiveness in reducing the societal, economic or health costs of drug misuse with an alternative approach based on treating drug addiction as a health issue, not a criminal one. And in an age of austerity, when we're told that every penny of public spending has to be justified, it seems very odd to me that no one's checking whether the war on drugs is actually value for money or money down the drain. And that's why I've called on the Prime Minister to undertake just such an impact assessment and a cost-benefit analysis. Moreover, reducing drug-related harm should be seen as a public health concern, and as such should be subject to the same kinds of effectiveness and efficiency standards as other areas of public health. And if an approach is shown to work, we should be building on it, not hiding behind ideology and political convenience. So one of my goals is to ensure that responsibility for drugs policy sits with the Department for Health, not with the Home Office, so that people dependent on drugs are treated as people with a medical issue, not as people that need to be punished. It's not a big ask, you might think, but it's one that very few politicians are prepared to support, despite this being the norm in Europe, and despite my finding clear support from those at the front line of drug policy delivery in my constituency. And in fact, I put this to a Home Office minister in an adjournment debate in Parliament just before the summer, and his response was so frustrating because he was willfully, deliberately, I'm quite sure, completely missing the point and completely answering a question that I hadn't put, which was about full legalisation. I think there are lots of good arguments around a fully decriminalised system, but that isn't actually what I was talking about at the time. Brighton and Hove's approach to drugs is also different because of the extent to which it acknowledges that it's a social issue as well. I said earlier that drug use destroys people, but so too does being locked up for an addiction, being marginalised for the subsequent criminal record, the stigma attached to drug use and increased risk of death on release from overdose. And I'm very mindful that it's usually the poorest in society that suffer the result of drug misuse. And I think it's crucial to differentiate between the suffering caused by drugs and the suffering caused by drugs policy. And I think there's quite a lot of argument to suggest that drugs policy in some ways is actually more damaging. For example, the vast majority of drug-related offending is a consequence of drugs policy, which keeps the price of drugs high. As the Global Commission on Drugs Policy states, in many countries the harm caused by drug prohibition in terms of corruption, violence and violation of human rights largely exceeds the harm caused by drugs. Here in the UK, researchers have found that, and I quote, law enforcement efforts can have a significant negative impact on the nature and extent of harms associated with drugs, by unintentionally increasing threats to public health and public safety, and by altering both the behaviour of individual drug users and the stability and operation of drug markets. Those at the Brighton and Hove Round Table largely agreed, and research by the Equality Trust shows a clear and demonstrable correlation between drug use and inequality. There's a strong tendency, for example, for drug use to be more common in more unequal societies like the UK. And so prevention, I think, also needs to encompass tackling inequality. And whilst interventions like the Healthy Child programme detailed in the Home Office's drug strategy are welcome, in a sense that's just the tip of the iceberg. The overall regressive nature of public spending cuts across the board won't help deliver a more equal society, or indeed, therefore, an environment which is more conducive to a decline in drug use. So Brighton and Hove wants to buck the trend and instead invest in more support for families and carers of drug users. We want to make sure that local policies reflect the fact that users are members of our community. For example, some at the Round Table want to explore the potential for learning from community resolution programmes and dissuasion commissions. And these could see drug-related offences addressed out of court and in ways that increase community accountability and promote restorative justice. Another of the challenges that we heard about at the Round Table was the changing nature of drug consumption in the city. At present, the focus of harm reduction work is around users of heroin, and in Brighton this affects an increasingly ageing population. Yet those working with young people highlighted the need to deliver services that prevent new users of cannabis or legal highs and meow from becoming long-term addicts. To some extent that's about education, and whilst there's no clear evidence that education reduces drug use, as a city there's certainly an interest in exploring that area further. It's also about getting better at identifying those potentially at risk, linking in with other services being accessed by young people, for example, around housing for those leaving care. And above all, it's about planning for the future now, so that in 25 years' time, we're not sitting around a table talking about high drug death rates, this time only to be linked to new substances. And tragically, unless there's a radical shift in the direction taken by the overarching national framework within which these aims sit, I fear that we could see more, not less, drug use amongst our young people. Alcohol plays a crucial role in the mix, both now and if regulation doesn't change, probably in the future too, as do, as I said earlier, the benzodiazepines. And again, a feature of the approach being taken in Brighton and Hove is to understand the complexity of substance misuse and to develop proposals that reflect the facts on the ground, which is woefully lacking at the moment. Are you about to waste me saying 2 minutes? Right. Let me just sum up. I wanted to talk a few words about naloxone. As a city, we want to continue with the kinds of work that's already being done in terms of making naloxone more available. It's already being made available to, for example, the ambulance services. And it's something that one of the doctors described to me when he became a doctor. Naloxone was the kind of wonder drug he always wanted to be able to give. In other words, if you've had an overdose, then naloxone can really make the difference between life and death. And if people were routinely given naloxone, for example, when they're exiting prison, if they have been addicts in the past, if the families around them were educated around how to use basically a little injecting pack, then seriously large numbers of lives, I think, could be saved. And just a few words about the riot trial in Brighton, the randomised injecting opioid treatment trial. And as many of you will know, this is one of the 3 trials to examine the effectiveness and cost-effectiveness of treatment with injected and oral opioids, methadone and heroin, for patients who were dependent on heroin but didn't respond to conventional oral methadone substitution treatment. And the main measure of effectiveness on the trial was the proportion of participants who stopped using illicit heroin. And I met some of the participants on the trial, and the stories they told about the way in which that trial has enabled them to take back control of their lives was incredibly moving. And I think rolling out that kind of riot trial to more cities around the country and making sure that we continue to have the resources for the continuance of riot here in Brighton and Hove is absolutely crucial. So let me just sum up by saying that the extent to which we can do things differently in one part of the country is obviously constrained by national government policy. But I do think that we should be calling the government's bluff a little bit on that. We do have the localism bill, which says that more decisions ought to be made locally. People locally are better placed to know what their cities need. And so I do think we should be pushing a little bit at the boundaries of what that makes possible. I think there's some fantastic work already going on in Brighton and Hove. And if we can scale that up, if we can learn from other countries, if we can experiment with other kinds of initiatives as well, then I think we could, if you like, show by results that there is a different approach possible. It's a more humane approach, and it's an approach that essentially reduces harm for everybody in society.